simplify. Rational expressions simplify. Now, here's the deal. There's two ways that you can do this. One of them is kind of the lazy way, which I think is probably harder. And there's the other way, which to me is not as bad. But here, let me write down an example problem, and then we'll discuss this. And here's where those of you that don't take your time might be a little confused. This is what it looks like. Z over x. If you really want, actually, why don't you open your book to page 246. So you can write it off your paper as opposed to listening to me. Letter F, page 246. Z negative 2x over w plus 5tz minus 2 over w to the negative 4th power. I'll give you a chance to write that down here. Before we go to actually simplifying this, let's just review a concept we talked about before. Because in math, you're never allowed to have zeros at the bottom of fractions, a lot of times when the book gives you a problem like this, they'll say, what are the excluded values? In other words, what can you never have? Because we can't deal with that here. And in this case, the excluded value would be what can't equal what, Charlie?
What would be the negative?
Well, you can have negatives. We can deal with negatives. We can't deal with zeros on the bottom of fractions. Which means what? What letter, Ashley, may I ask? Let me rephrase the question. When would you get a zero on the bottom of a fraction?
Never.
Notice that z, x, and w could be any numbers at all. Morgan?
When w equals 0.
Right, so if the book asks you for the excluded values, you'd have to say w cannot equal 0. Because if you put a 0 in for w, you'd get a 0 on the bottom of the fraction, and zeros can't happen. Got that? That's kind of like the first thing I'll ask you. Now, this, ladies and gentlemen, is nothing more than distributive property. Okay? And here is the two ways that you can go about doing this. If you're really interested in getting them right, because I think this makes it simpler for you, if I were you, you could just multiply these as they are together, and it would work, and then you'd have to simplify it. But I would suggest to you that your first step would be to make or put everything in the numerator. Put everything in the numerator. Which means one of the things that makes this all confusing is that you've got negative exponents and such, and blah, blah, blah. I would change this. Anything that has anything on the bottom, I would move it to the top. And it's a pretty simple thing to do. If I were changing this one, I would get still zx, right? But I move the w to the top, it becomes w squared. Are you with me? You move it to the top, exponent changes to its opposite. Right?
Yes.
Stop me there if you don't get that. And then in parentheses, I still have my two top things there, z, d, negative 2x, and then I move the w to the top, which is going to make it
Negative.
w negative 1, because it has a positive 1 exponent, moves to the top, becomes negative 1 exponent. The second one already is on top, so you don't have to do anything. tz, and the last one would end up being minus 2, what? W to the 4th power. Now to me, this just looks a lot easier to do than that, just because I'm not dealing with fractions. If you didn't get that, all I did was moved up anything on the bottom to the top. And then you can multiply, due to distributive property, the dist prop, and you'd end up with z times z is z squared. I'll multiply these two together first. X times x is x squared. What is w squared times w to the negative 1st power? What happened to my d? Where'd my d squared go? My d negative 2 is still there. W squared and a w negative 1 is just the w. Got that for the first one? Stop me there if you didn't get that. What's that? 2 z's get the z squared. 2 x's give you x squared. D squared, d negative 2 doesn't have a d, so it just stays that. W2, w negative 1 gives you w to the 1st. Plus, you can all lump me on later. 5 times, what do I have here? Well, z and a z is a z squared. X, no x over there, so it stays x. W squared, no w squared over there, so it stays w squared. And there's a t stuck there still. Correct? And then this term times this gives you a 2 zx and w squared and a w to the 4th is w6. Did I get that right? Now you're almost done. The only well, stop me there if you didn't catch what happened there. Just putting the letters together, multiplying, adding exponents if they have them. And then the last step is, the only thing that's wrong with this is you can't have negative exponents in your answers. So step 3, you have to get rid of the negative exponents. Which just means I need to move this d to the bottom. So the z squared, x squared, w stay on top, but the d has to go to the bottom for d squared. The rest of these, I don't see any other negative exponents to you. Is that x w to the 6th? And this would be your answer. Which is pretty simple sort of stuff. Should I read you the answer to see if it's the same as I have? Now, once you get to this, though, children, what do you notice you have here? A variable on the bottom of a fraction. So in addition, when you get done with this, you have to look at this again and say, you know what? I cannot have a 0 for d either, because that would give me a 0 on the bottom. So now you've got those 2 excluded things. W because it's w up here, and d squared because it's a d squared down there. Mesmerized. I can tell you're absolutely mesmerized. Now here's the deal. Okay, you don't really have to do this step. Okay, you don't have to do this because I could just multiply the tops and the bottoms together and get another fraction. In the end, you're going to end up with this. But to me, after 20 some odd plus years of doing this, this just makes it a lot simpler to me, I think. I could multiply all this top and this bottom stuff and get fractions and do all that. But I think it's just more confusing when you do it that way. If you'd like, I could show you that. Sure. No. This is, well, I'm just going to show you, just so you don't think that I'm just doing this to make your life painful. But sometimes I do. If you did not move everything to the top of the fraction, this is just what it would look like. You'd have to multiply, if you multiply this fraction with this fraction, you have to multiply, you would get the z squared on top, the x squared on top, the d minus 2 on top, and then on bottom, when you multiply the 2 w things together, you get w to the negative 1st power. Over here, you would get, you put this over 1, so it's a fraction. You get z squared t x, there's a 5 there, and then on the bottom you get a w negative 2, correct? And then over here you get 2 times zx, which is 2zx, and then on bottom you get w to the negative 6 power. And then from there you'd have to simplify it by moving, you'd have to move this w to the top, but then you'd have to move this d to the bottom. You'd have to move this w to the top and that w to the top. Maybe you like this better, okay? That's fine if you do and you want to do it that way, but don't come back to me and say, I don't know why I got this wrong. But you don't do it my way, which I think just makes it easier. Good point. Let me give you one and you try it. And that was probably the hardest one of all. I will actually make this problem number 12 of the book. And I'll see how many of you get the right answer. W squared p over t times 4 over w to the 4th minus t squared over p to the 5th. And I will let you actually do that because I'm not gonna. And we'll see if we actually made any heads or proverbial tails of over this. Answer? Question?
Yes. When you bring W4 up, is it negative?
It will be negative, as will the p be negative 5. Question? Giving everybody a chance here.
I'm supposed to do the excluded values.
Sure, write down what you think the excluded values would be as well. What can't be 0? What letters can't be 0? In the whole excluded value world. You should have answers by now, I would think. Ashley says
4w squared over t minus t over t to the 4w.
I have no idea. Let's do it here. You know you've got a 4. W squared, W negative 4 is W to the negative 2. P is by itself T negative 1.
Wait.
Huh?
Oh, never mind. You already wrote one?
T negative 1, W negative 2,
Yeah.
T minus no W. P and P to the negative 5th is P to the negative 4th. And then T negative 1, T2 is just T. Making all your things positive, you get 4P on top over W squared T on bottom minus WT on top and P to the 4th on the bottom.
It's W squared.
Where's W squared?
On top,
Second.
Here? Oh, W squared.
Wait.
I got P because if those both negative, so it would negative 6 and then I go to the bottom.
This is a positive one.
No, but this, isn't that?
And then for your excluded value, you look at all the places there could be, and any letter that ends up on the bottom has to be an excluded value. So T cannot equal 0 because of this. W cannot equal 0 because of this. P cannot equal 0 because of this. And T cannot equal 0 over there. That's all the letters there are. So none of those three could be zeros. Now stop me here if this didn't, if you didn't catch something. Charlie,
And I was kind of confused with why it can't be zero.
because you can never have a zero on the bottom of a fraction.
But I'm not going to
Because t would be on the zero on the bottom of this fraction. W would make a zero on the bottom of that fraction, t would make a zero on the bottom of that fraction.
Oh,
If either one of these two was zero, you'd get a zero on the bottom of the fraction. If this is zero, you get a bottom of the fraction. Carolyn?
How'd you get the negative exponents? You just moved the knots to make it negative?
At what point? Here or
Yeah.
down here? Here?
Yeah.
Yeah, because when I move this w to make it, to get it out of fraction form, I move that w to the top, it becomes -4 exponent. When I move this p to the top, it becomes p to the -5.
Okay.
It doesn't change it from negative to positive, it changes the exponents. What?
Let's do another one.
One more? These are not my favorite things to do, can I tell you? Sure, this will be problem number 11.
No, you're,
G -2s over s b squared, d squared, times G -3s -1 over b -1 plus 4 over b cubed. And the survey will say. Answers? Zach Rice says,
I got G to the 5th, B plus 4 on top 4s, G squared, B to the 5th.
no idea. Multiplying this times this, G -2, G -3 is G -5. S and S to the first gives you S to the 0 power, which means it goes away because that's the same as 1. B to the -2 times B to the 1 is B to the -1. Correct? Plus 4, G -2, S, B -5.
Why'd you think S? What was S? I thought that was a 5.
This is a 5, sir. This is an S. You'll tell my S's, Charlie, because my top is always a square corner. I never make my 5s like that. It's always down and across. And then, what do I do with this? You put them on the bottom, what has to end up on top? There's still a 1. G to the 5th, B, plus 4s over G squared B5. Excluded values, B can't be 0, G can't be 0.
Wait, what is it? G to the 5th?
It doesn't matter, because 0 to the 5th power is,
It says S can't be zero.
Oh,
who can't be 0?
That's what,
Where, what says that?
number 11,
Well, number 11 is multiple choice, isn't it?
where B, G, and S can't be zero. But I got that.
Oh, does anybody wanna tell me why S can't be 0?
Because 4 times 0 is 0.
Because of this. If you think about it at this point right here, that really is the same thing as having an S on the bottom. Because that's the -1 moved to the bottom is S. So apparently S can't be 0 either.
and G, cause, oh wait.
Oh, G should have been 1. Enough of that, I'm tired of this one.